I had been working late again, something I'd grown used to over the past few months. The demands of my job seemed to never stop, and with each passing week, late nights became more and more common. Chicago, much like my work schedule, never truly slept. It was a city constantly buzzing with life, even when the clock ticked past midnight. Walking home during these late hours had become second nature to me, and though the streets were quieter, the city still held that familiar hum of activity. As I stepped out of the office, the cool night air hit my face, refreshing after hours spent in front of a computer screen. The streets were relatively empty. There weren't many cars, only the occasional one driving by. Headlights briefly lighting up the sidewalk before disappearing into the distance far off. I could hear the faint but steady sound of the L train as it passed through its tracks above the city. The familiarity of these sounds usually brought me some comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone in the vast city. But tonight, something felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the usual flood of notifications, not really paying much attention. There was a message from a friend, something about making plans for the weekend, and a reminder that a bill was due tomorrow. The mundanity of it all felt reassuring in its own way. Normal life continued, despite my exhaustion. As I approached my building, the glowing streetlights flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. I noticed Tom, my neighbor, standing near the garbage bins outside. He had a cigarette between his fingers, the glowing ember briefly lighting up his face every time he took a drag. Tom and I weren't close, but we had exchanged friendly nods and brief conversations on occasion. He was the kind of neighbor you knew in passing, but not much beyond that. "Burning the midnight oil again?" Tom asked, exhaling a cloud of smoke as I neared. "Yeah, work's been pretty crazy lately," I replied, pausing for a moment. My body was tired, but the walk home always made me feel like I was winding down for the night. "What about you?" I added. "You're up late." Tom shrugged, taking another slow drag from his cigarette. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd step out for a bit. You know how it is." I nodded, the tiredness in my muscles now catching up with me. "Yeah, I get it. Well, I'll see you around." "Take it easy," Tom replied, nodding in return. With that, I pushed open the door to my building. The quiet inside the lobby was a stark contrast to the soft murmur of the city outside. The elevator, as usual, took its time arriving. I stared at the scratched metal panel next to the buttons, waiting for the familiar creaking of the elevator to reach my floor. 4th floor. It wasn't a long ride, but tonight it felt slower than usual. As I leaned against the elevator wall, I found myself absent-mindedly checking my phone again. More notifications, more things to deal with tomorrow. My mind wandered as the elevator ascended, thinking about all the tasks piling up, but that train of thought was interrupted as the elevator doors finally slid open. Stepping into the hallway, I was greeted by silence. The dim lights overhead buzzed softly, casting long, uneven shadows along the walls. My apartment was at the far end of the hall, and as I walked toward it, I noticed something odd. A faint light was spilling out from underneath my door. At first, I shrugged it off. I must have left the lamp on when I left for work. It wouldn't have been the first time. But as I got closer to the door, a strange feeling crept over me, like something was off, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I reached for the doorknob out of habit, but just as my fingers brushed against it, I froze. The door wasn't closed all the way. It was barely noticeable, just a small crack, so small that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. A knot began to form in my stomach. I knew I hadn't left the door like this. I always made sure to lock it before leaving, and I distinctly remembered hearing the reassuring click of the lock when I left this morning. Now, though, it was open, just enough to make me feel uneasy. I hesitated for a moment, standing there with my hand hovering over the doorknob. My mind raced, trying to come up with explanations. Maybe I had been in such a hurry this morning that I didn't pull the door shut all the way. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, the feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. I reached for the door and, with a slow, cautious push, opened it. The door creaked softly as it swung inward, and I stepped inside. My apartment was quiet, as it always was, and everything seemed to be in its place. The small lamp in the living room cast a warm glow over the room, making everything feel familiar. But something still didn't sit right with me. I walked over to the door and quickly locked it behind me, twisting the lock back and forth to make sure it was secure this time. I tossed my keys onto the counter, trying to shake off the uneasiness that had settled over me. That's when I saw it. A photograph lying on the coffee table. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't left anything on the coffee table before leaving for work. I didn't even own any printed photos. I walked over to the table, my heart now pounding in my chest. The photo was of me, taken earlier today. I recognized the street in the background. It was from my walk home. My hands shook as I picked it up, flipping it over to see if there was anything written on the back. There wasn't. A wave of panic washed over me. Whoever took this photo had been watching me. They had followed me, and now they had been inside my apartment. My stomach tightened, and my mind raced with questions. How did they get in? Had I really left the door unlocked? I quickly scanned the room again, looking for any signs that something else had been disturbed, but everything seemed to be in its place. I walked over to the windows. They were all locked. Nothing seemed out of place, but the photograph on the coffee table was enough to make my skin crawl. Suddenly my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out, half expecting to see a message from whoever had been watching me, but it wasn't. It was a text from Tom, my neighbor. "Hey, you okay? You looked kind of off earlier," the message read. I stared at the screen, my thoughts too scattered to reply right away. Tom had been outside when I came home. Could he have noticed something? Should I tell him about the photo? A part of me wanted to, but another part of me felt like I needed to keep it to myself. At least for now. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. After a long pause, I typed out a quick reply. "Yeah, just a rough day at work. Thanks for checking in." I set my phone down on the counter, running a hand through my hair as I tried to calm my racing thoughts. The photograph still sat there on the table, taunting me. My mind raced with questions. Who had taken it? Why leave it here? How had they gotten in? To distract myself, I turned on the TV, hoping that some background noise would help steady my nerves. But I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting back to the coffee table, to the photograph of me that didn't belong there. It was almost like someone wanted me to know I was being watched. Someone who knew I'd come home and find their little message. I stood up and began pacing the room, checking the windows again, even though I knew they were already locked. My eyes scanned every corner of the apartment, looking for anything else out of place, but there was nothing. Just the photo. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Tom. "If you need anything, let me know. I'm up for a while." I stared at the message, feeling a growing sense of unease. Tom had always been friendly, but now it seemed like he was paying extra attention to me. Had he noticed something? Or was I just being paranoid? I hadn't thought much of it before, but now, with everything that had happened, it seemed strange that he was so concerned. I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I continued pacing, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight, and sleep felt impossible. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone suspicious, or if there had been any signs that I was being followed. Then, there was a soft knock at the door. The sound sent a jolt through my body. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. I hesitated, my heart racing as I tiptoed toward the door and peered through the peephole. It was Tom, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking casual. For a brief second I felt relieved, but then I remembered the photograph on the coffee table, and my nerves tightened again. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on, and tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey, what's up?" I asked, peering through the small opening in the door. Tom smiled, though his expression seemed a little off. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice casual. "I thought I heard something strange earlier, like someone messing with your door. Just wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay." His words sent a chill down my spine. "You heard someone?" I repeated, my hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Yeah," Tom said, glancing behind me into the apartment as if he was trying to see inside. "Probably just some drunk passing through, but it didn't feel right. Thought I'd better check in, just to be sure." Something about the way he said it felt off. Why hadn't he mentioned it earlier when I'd walked past him outside? And if he had heard someone, why hadn't he knocked then or called me? I wasn't sure what to think, but my gut told me not to trust him, at least not right now. "I'm fine," I said quickly, trying to close the door a little more. "Thanks for checking, though." Tom's smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. "Okay, Well, if you need anything, just let me know. I'll be up for a while. I nodded, forcing a smile. Thanks, I said before closing the door completely and locking it. As soon as I was alone again, I let out a shaky breath. The whole situation was starting to feel more and more surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with Tom. Why was he suddenly paying so much attention to me? Why now, of all nights? I glanced back at the photo on the coffee table, the eerie reminder that someone had been inside my apartment. My stomach churned, and a creeping sense of paranoia began to settle in. Then my phone buzzed again, and I nearly jumped. It was another message from Tom. Sorry if I freaked you out. Just trying to be a good neighbor. I stared at the message, feeling my skin crawl. He was being too attentive, too involved. It was hard not to connect the dots. First the unlocked door, then the photo, and now Tom always seeming to be around at the perfect moment. Was I overthinking things, or was there something more to his concern? I decided to call someone. I needed to talk about what was happening, even if I wasn't sure what to believe. I dialed my friend Sarah's number. She was the only person I could think of who might understand or at least help me figure out what to do. As the phone rang, I paced around the living room, my nerves on edge. When Sarah finally picked up, her voice was groggy from sleep. Hey, everything okay? She asked, clearly half asleep. I don't know, I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. Something weird is going on. Someone was in my apartment earlier, I think. They left a photo of me from today. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was more alert. Wait, what? Someone was in your apartment? Did you call the police? I haven't yet, I said, glancing at the photo again. I'm not even sure what to tell them. It's so bizarre. And Tom, my neighbor, he's been acting weird. He keeps checking on me like he knows something, but I don't know if I'm just being paranoid. Tom? That guy who lives next door? Sarah asked, sounding concerned. Yeah, I said, lowering my voice even though I was alone. He's been around every time something strange happens. He texted me right after I found the photo, said he saw someone hanging around my door earlier. It's almost like he's watching me. Okay, that's definitely creepy, Sarah said, her voice more serious now. You need to call the police, even if it's nothing. You can't take any chances. I know, I muttered, feeling torn between my fear and my uncertainty. But it's so hard to know what's real and what's not. Tom's always been friendly, but now it feels different. Sarah was firm. Look, you're not being paranoid. Someone left a photo in your apartment. That's serious. You should call the police and stay away from Tom, just in case. I took a deep breath, realizing she was right. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Thanks, Sarah. Stay safe, okay? Call me if you need anything, she said before we hung up. Once I was off the phone, I sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. My mind raced with everything that had happened, the unlocked door, the photograph, Tom's strange behavior. It was all too much to ignore. Finally, I dialed the non-emergency police number. My hand shook as I held the phone to my ear, waiting for someone to pick up. When the dispatcher answered, I explained the situation as clearly as I could, though it felt strange even as the words left my mouth. How do you explain something like this without sounding crazy? I think someone's been watching me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, and I think they've been inside my apartment. The dispatcher took down my information and asked for more details. I described the photo, the unlocked door, and Tom's strange behavior. They assured me that an officer would be sent to check things out. I sat on the couch, my heart racing as I waited for the knock at the door. It wasn't long before I heard it. A firm, authoritative knock that sent a jolt through me. When I checked the peephole, I saw 2 police officers standing outside, dressed in their navy blue uniforms. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and let them inside. One of the officers, a tall man with tired eyes, introduced himself. Ma'am, we're here to follow up on your report. Can we ask you a few questions? I nodded, still feeling uneasy despite their presence. I led them into the living room, where the photograph still sat on the coffee table like some haunting reminder of what had happened. The officer asked me to go over everything in more detail, and I did my best to explain. I told them about the strange feeling I'd had when I noticed the door was open, the way the photo had been left on the table, and Tom's odd behavior. As I spoke, the second officer quietly walked around the apartment, checking the windows and the locks. Have you noticed anyone suspicious hanging around recently? The first officer asked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to mention Tom. "There's my neighbor, Tom. He's been checking on me a lot lately. At first, I thought he was just being nice, but now, I don't know. He always seems to be around when something weird happens." The officer nodded, his expression neutral. "We'll talk to him, just to cover all the bases." I stayed in the living room as the officers went down the hall to talk to Tom. I couldn't hear much of their conversation, just muffled voices through the door. My nerves were on edge, and I paced back and forth, glancing at the clock. It felt like an eternity before the officers returned. "Your neighbor says he hasn't noticed anything unusual," the officer told me when they came back, "but he did express concern for your safety. He offered to keep an eye out for anything suspicious." I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. "Look," the officer continued, his tone calm but firm, "there's not much we can do right now, but we'll keep a patrol car outside tonight, just in case. You should try to get some rest. If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call us." I thanked them as they left, feeling a slight sense of relief knowing that the police would be nearby. Maybe now, with someone watching over the apartment, I could finally get some rest. But even with the patrol car outside, sleep was impossible. The events of the night kept replaying in my mind. The eerie photo, the sounds outside my door, Tom's strange messages. The fear sat deep in my chest, refusing to let go. Every creak of the apartment made me jump. The small knife I kept in my bag for protection was now clutched tightly in my hand as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I felt no better. The next day passed in a fog. I went to work, but my thoughts were miles away, still stuck on the events of the previous night. Every step I took felt heavy, like I was moving through quicksand. By the time I left the office, the sky had already darkened, and the feeling of unease crept back in. I decided to stop by a convenience store on my way home. I figured a snack and a drink might help me relax, maybe distract me enough to watch a movie and forget about everything for a little while. The bright lights of the store were a welcome contrast to the dark streets outside. I grabbed a soda and a bag of chips, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that clung to me. The cashier smiled at me as I paid, but I could barely muster a smile in return. The cold night air hit me again as I left the store, clutching the plastic bag tightly in my hand. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the flickering streetlights casting long, distorted shadows over the cars. A sense of unease crept over me as I walked through the lot, the cold biting at my skin. The streetlights above flickered, creating an unsettling rhythm that seemed to sync with the pounding of my heart. Each shadow cast on the pavement felt longer, darker, and the silence was deafening. There wasn't a soul around, and yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if someone was watching me. Every step I took felt louder than it should have, echoing in the still night. I tried to shake off the paranoia that had been building in my mind since last night. I told myself I was just jumpy from everything that had happened, but no matter how much I tried to calm myself, the feeling wouldn't go away. My fingers brushed the small knife I'd started keeping in my jacket pocket, just in case. My mind kept replaying the events of the previous night, the unlocked door, the photograph, Tom's strange concern. As I walked faster, the plastic bag swinging at my side, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. But the lot was still empty, just rows of parked cars and the dim flicker of the overhead lights. That's when it happened. Suddenly, everything went dark. A thick, rough bag was yanked over my head with brutal force, cutting off my vision and plunging me into terrifying darkness. Before I could react, strong hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing tight, and I felt my breath being snuffed out in an instant. Panic surged through me like a bolt of electricity. I kicked and thrashed wildly, trying to scream, but the fabric of the bag muffled the sound, trapping it inside. My lungs burned, screaming for air, but each desperate gasp was cut short by the iron grip around my neck. Every second felt like an eternity, my body struggling for oxygen, my heart pounding furiously in my chest. I had to fight back. I couldn't just let this happen. My hands fumbled toward my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold steel of the knife I had stashed there for protection. With the last bit of strength I had left, I yanked the knife free and swung it blindly behind me, hoping to make contact with my attacker. I felt the blade hit flesh. A low, guttural grunt of pain followed. and the grip on my throat loosened just enough for me to pull the bag from my head and suck in a sharp breath of air. My vision swam as I stumbled forward, gasping and choking as my lungs greedily filled with oxygen. I forced myself to turn around, my body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Standing there, clutching his side where I had slashed him, was a man. Blood seeped between his fingers, darkening the fabric of his clothes, but it was his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. They were filled with rage, burning with a hatred that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I rasped, my voice shaking, barely able to speak through the fear gripping me. The man's lips twisted into a cruel, twisted grin. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice low, seething with contempt. "Of course, you wouldn't." I stared at him, struggling to place his face. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but it was like trying to remember a distant dream, a face long forgotten in the background of my past. "You think you're so much better than me," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You never even looked at me back then. You laughed, like I didn't matter. Brr." His words hit me like a cold wave. High school. He had been there, a quiet presence always lurking in the background, someone I had barely noticed. A memory stirred, faint and blurry, but it was enough to make my stomach twist with dread. "You," I whispered, the realization dawning on me. "I barely remember you." His grin widened, but there was no humor in it, only malice. "Exactly. You didn't remember me. You never thought I was worth noticing, but I've been watching you. I swore you'd pay for it one day." He took a shaky step forward, despite the wound I had inflicted. Blood dripped onto the pavement beneath him, but the pain seemed to fuel his anger rather than slow him down. "I didn't want your love," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to be nothing, to feel hunted, to feel powerless." Brr. Fear surged through me as his words sank in. This wasn't just some random attack. He had planned this. He had waited years for this moment, simmering in his hatred, biding his time until he could make me suffer for something I hadn't even known I'd done. I backed away, my hands shaking, gripping the knife tightly. "I don't understand," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "That was years ago. Why now?" His face contorted with fury. "You thought you could laugh at me and walk away? I've waited all this time to make you pay, to make you suffer like I did." His legs wobbled, and he collapsed to the ground, weakened by the blood loss. He was breathing heavily now, gasping for air as his strength began to fade. I stood there, frozen, watching him struggle, trying to comprehend the horror that had just unfolded. This man, someone I had barely known from my past, had been plotting his revenge for years, harboring a twisted obsession that had brought him to this moment. But then, a sound broke through the silence, a soft chime. It was the sound of a text message. My pulse quickened, and I looked down at the man, now slumped on the ground. His phone, tucked in his jacket pocket, was the source of the noise. My heart raced as I crouched down, my hands trembling, and reached into his pocket to pull out the phone. The screen glowed with a new notification. The message read, "Did you get the job done?" My blood ran cold as I read the words. He wasn't working alone. Someone else had been involved in this, someone who had been giving him orders, or perhaps paying him to carry out this attack. With growing terror, I scrolled up through the conversation. My heart pounded in my chest as I saw photo after photo of myself, walking to work, leaving my apartment, going about my daily life. He had been watching me for weeks, maybe even months, sending these photos to his accomplice with disturbing regularity. As I scrolled further, the messages became even more chilling. "Make sure she finds the pictures," one message read. Another, from earlier that night, said, "Tonight's the night. Finish this." Then came the most horrifying message of all. "I don't care what you do, as long as I get paid." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Whoever had sent these messages wasn't just interested in revenge. This was about money. This was calculated. With shaking hands, I opened my own phone and compared the unknown number to my contacts, praying I wouldn't find a match. But as I scrolled through my contact list, my worst fear was realized. The number matched. It was Tom, the friendly, seemingly harmless neighbor who had always been so concerned about my well-being, who had texted me after I found the photo, who had checked on me after hearing something strange outside my door. He had been involved in this all along. He had been feeding information to the man who had just attacked me, manipulating me, watching me, and betraying me. I felt sick to my stomach. The betrayal was too much to process. Tom, the person I thought was looking out for me, had been orchestrating this nightmare from the very beginning. I dialed the police, my hands trembling as I explained everything: the attack, the messages, the horrifying realization that Tom had been involved all along. My voice shook as I tried to give them the details, but I was too overwhelmed to make sense of it all. They assured me that officers would be on their way immediately. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. I heard them knocking at Tom's door, their voices echoing down the hallway. I stayed hidden inside my apartment, peeking through the door, watching as the police questioned him. Tom opened the door, acting confused and innocent, as if he had no idea what was going on. But it didn't last long. Within moments, the police had him in handcuffs. His calm facade cracked for just a brief second as his eyes met mine. There was something dark and cold in his gaze as they led him past me down the hallway. He didn't say much, but just before they took him away, he leaned close enough for me to hear him whisper, "You were always so easy to fool." A cold shiver ran down my spine. His words were like a final twist of the knife. I had been deceived, manipulated, and nearly destroyed by someone I thought I could trust. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. As I sat alone in my apartment that night, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. I had come so close to losing everything: my life, my sense of security, and my trust in the people around me. I had thought I knew who the real danger was, but the truth had been right in front of me the whole time, hidden behind the friendly smile of a neighbor. Now I knew better. The world felt darker, colder, and far more dangerous than I had ever realized. I still remember that Halloween night as clearly as if it had just happened, even though it was back in the fall of 1998. I was 13 years old, and at that age, I was straddling the line between childhood and adolescence. Halloween was still magical, still thrilling, but I knew it was likely my last year trick-or-treating. That weird, in-between stage where you're not quite ready to let go of childhood, but you feel that pull toward growing up. It made the night feel different, special, like I had to make the most of it. My best friends, Josh and Ethan, had been as excited as I was. For weeks leading up to Halloween, we planned what we'd do, but it wasn't just about the candy anymore. In our town, Halloween was more than just a night to score treats. It was an event, almost like a carnival without the rides. Streets would be crowded with costumed kids running around, while parents partied on their porches or driveways, handing out candy and spiked cider as they laughed and enjoyed the night. The air would be filled with the sound of rustling leaves, giggles, and the occasional scream from someone getting spooked by a good scare. There was something in the air that night, something electric. The weather was perfect that evening. The air had that crisp bite to it, just cold enough that you could see your breath when you exhaled, but not so cold that you needed more than a hoodie or light jacket. You could smell the damp earth from the fallen leaves and that distinct scent of plastic costumes mixed with the sweetness of candy in the air. The light from jack-o'-lanterns flickered on every doorstep, casting an orange glow that danced in the darkness. We met at Josh's house just as the sun began to sink below the horizon. The sky was streaked with deep purple and orange, giving way to the creeping shadows of dusk. Josh's parents were throwing one of their Halloween parties for adults, big bowls of cider for the kids, and a spiked version for themselves. They barely noticed us as we slipped out into the night, dressed in our thrown-together costumes. Josh had slathered some zombie makeup on his face, Ethan wore a scream mask, and I'd grabbed a cheap Batman cape and paired it with a black hoodie. None of us cared too much about the costumes. The night was about freedom, candy, and adventure. Starting the night, the three of us started on Josh's street, knocking on the doors of familiar neighbors. Porch lights were already glowing, and the sidewalks were alive with the buzz of children. We heard the crunch of leaves beneath our feet as we walked from house to house, pillowcases ready to be filled. The wind rustled the branches overhead, sending more leaves tumbling to the ground. The first wave of little kids was out with their parents, dragging oversized candy bags and chattering excitedly. The excitement of Halloween was infectious. As we moved through the neighborhood, the sun finally disappeared. leaving only the orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns and the flickering streetlights to light the way. The sound of laughter and distant screams from other trick-or-treaters filled the air, along with the occasional rustle of costumes. It felt like the perfect Halloween night, like something out of a movie, where the town seemed to embrace the spooky magic of the holiday. After a few blocks, we started talking about where to go next. Franklin Street was the obvious choice. It was the best street for trick-or-treating, hands down. The houses were huge, old Victorians that had been standing for over a century, and the families that lived there went all out. Every year they tried to outdo each other with decorations, from fake gravestones to fog machines to glowing skeletons. And the candy? Full-sized bars. No tiny fun-sized stuff here. Franklin Street was where the serious trick-or-treaters went. The Mallow House, a dare too tempting. But Franklin Street had one house that everyone avoided, the Mallow House. The Mallow House wasn't like the others. It didn't have the fun, over-the-top Halloween decorations. In fact, it didn't have any decorations at all. The house itself was old, 3 stories tall with peeling paint and windows that seemed to sag. The yard was overgrown, with weeds and tall grass spilling onto the sidewalk, and the trees in the yard were twisted, their branches thick with shadows. The place had been creepy for as long as I could remember. And then there were the Mallows themselves. Mr. Mallow and his wife were old, much older than anyone else in the neighborhood, but no one ever saw them. They never came outside. The only time anyone caught a glimpse of Mr. Mallow was when he grabbed the mail, and even then, he'd disappear back into the house before anyone could wave or say hello. As for Mrs. Mallow, no one had seen her in years. There were rumors, of course. Some said she had dementia and was locked away in one of the upstairs rooms. Others whispered that she had died, and Mr. Mallow was hiding her body. As we walked down Franklin Street, Ethan pointed toward the Mallow house, half joking but with a hint of nervousness in his voice. "How much candy do I get if one of you knocks on their door?" he asked, smirking. Josh, never one to back down from a dare, grinned. "I'll give you half my candy if you do it." I laughed, but it was forced. "Yeah, and then what? Get murdered by the creepy old guy?" But even as I joked, there was that familiar feeling inside me. The challenge, the dare, the one thing you weren't supposed to do on Halloween. The Mallow house was a line no one crossed, and that made it tempting. We had been daring each other to go near that house for years, but none of us had ever actually gone through with it. As we moved closer to the house, the mood shifted. The excited banter between us faded into silence. The Mallow house loomed ahead, dark and still, as if it were watching us. The gate at the front of the yard was open, creaking slightly in the wind. The path leading to the porch covered in wet leaves. There were no decorations, no signs of Halloween cheer, just the old, decaying house sitting there like a shadow at the end of the street. Josh nudged me with that familiar look of determination on his face. "I'll go if you go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. My stomach clenched. I didn't want to go, but there was no way I was backing down, not in front of Josh and Ethan. "Fine," I muttered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "But we knock, get the candy and get out, fast." Ethan looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. "Guys, this place is messed up. Let's just go to the other houses. Forget it." But Josh had that grin on his face, the one that said he wasn't about to back down, and I couldn't let him go alone. So, with a deep breath, I followed him across the street and toward the house. Approaching the house, the closer we got, the heavier the air seemed to become. The wind died down, and the laughter from the other trick-or-treaters faded until it felt like we were in a bubble of silence. The front gate creaked as we pushed it open, the hinges rusty and stiff. Josh was the first to step through, leading the way with a confidence I knew was just a front. I followed, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me, and Ethan trailed behind, looking over his shoulder as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows. The path to the front door was slick with wet leaves, and the porch steps groaned under our weight as we climbed them. The house towered over us, its windows dark and lifeless. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we reached the front door, a massive oak door with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The paint on the door was cracked and peeling, and the windows were covered in thick, dusty curtains that hadn't been opened in years. I reached out for the knocker, my hand trembling slightly as I grabbed the cold metal. My fingers wrapped around it, and I hesitated for a moment. my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. But before I could talk myself out of it, I brought the knocker down with a loud thunk. The sound echoed through the house, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. We waited, the three of us standing there, barely breathing, as the sound of the knocker faded away. I was starting to think no one was home when we heard it. The creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the house. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was in there. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until we heard the unmistakable sound of a lock being turned. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A voice, low and raspy, drifted out from the shadows. "Come in." I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced at Josh, waiting for him to say something, anything, but his face had gone pale. Ethan took a step back, his face a mask of fear. "No way, man," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "This is a bad idea. Let's just go." But before any of us could move, the door creaked open wider. The darkness inside seemed to spill out onto the porch, thick and heavy, like a living thing. And then, from the shadows, Mr. Mallow stepped forward. He looked even older up close, more gaunt than I'd imagined. His skin was waxy and stretched too tightly over his bones, his frame so thin that he looked almost skeletal. His eyes were sunken, shadowed in deep hollows that gave him a lifeless, hollow expression. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at us with those cold, empty eyes. It felt like he was looking right through us, not at us. Then, after a long, uncomfortable pause, his cracked lips moved. "Trick or treat." His voice was dry, barely more than a whisper, but there was something unsettling about it. Josh, always trying to act brave, cleared his throat and stammered, "Trick or treat." For a moment, Mr. Mallow didn't respond. His gaze moved from Josh to me, and then to Ethan, who was still standing a few steps behind us, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Mr. Mallow's lips twitched, as if trying to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. Slowly, he raised one hand and motioned for us to come inside. "You boys are just in time," he rasped. "We've been waiting." That sentence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "We? Waiting for us?" I glanced at Josh, hoping he'd say something, anything that would break the tension, but he just stood there, frozen. Ethan took another step back, shaking his head more frantically now. "I'm out of here. This is too weird," he muttered under his breath. And then, before any of us could react, we heard a noise from inside the house. It was faint at first, a soft creaking sound, like old wood shifting under pressure, but it was getting louder, closer. I squinted into the dark hallway behind Mr. Mallow, trying to see what was causing the noise, and then I saw it. Movement. Something or someone was coming toward the door. At first it was just a shadow, something shifting in the gloom, but as it came closer, my stomach dropped. It was Mrs. Mallow. Or at least, it looked like her, but something was wrong, horribly wrong. She moved slowly, awkwardly, as if her body didn't quite work the way it should. Her head was tilted to one side, and her limbs seemed stiff, almost jerky, as she shuffled forward. Her skin was pale, so pale it almost looked translucent in the dim light, and it sagged in odd places, hanging loosely from her bones. Her hair was thin and matted, clinging to her scalp in greasy strands. But it was her face that truly terrified me. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them, just empty, black pits that seemed to stare straight through us. Her mouth hung open slightly, and a low, wet, gurgling noise came from her throat, like she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. She stumbled closer, her arms hanging limply at her sides, and my body locked up. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was like my brain had short-circuited, too shocked to process what was happening in front of me. Josh took a step back, his face pale, his bravado completely gone. What is that?" he whispered. Ethan was already backing down the steps, his eyes wide with terror. Nope, nope," he muttered, turning and bolting for the street. "I'm done. I'm out." That was all it took. My survival instincts kicked in, and I grabbed Josh's arm. "We have to go, now," I hissed. Josh didn't need any more convincing. We turned and sprinted down the porch steps, our feet pounding against the wood, hearts racing. Behind us, I could hear the door creak shut, the sound of it closing filling the night air like the end of some terrible, unspeakable nightmare. I didn't dare look back. We caught up with Ethan a few houses down, all of us panting and gasping for breath. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop running until we were well away from the Mallow house. When we finally stopped, none of us said anything for a long time. We just stood there, our hands on our knees, gulping down air, trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. The night around us felt normal again. Kids still running around in their costumes, parents chatting and laughing in front of their houses, the familiar Halloween sounds of laughter and excitement echoing through the streets. But for us, it felt like the world had changed in an instant. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "Did you see that? Was that even real? What the hell just happened?" Josh didn't say anything at first. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have a smart remark, no joke to make. He just stared at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he muttered, "That wasn't normal. There's no way that was normal." I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "We should tell someone," I said, but my words didn't have much conviction. What were we going to say? That we saw something unnatural? That we had been invited into a house where a woman who looked like she had been dead for years was walking around? Josh shook his head. "No one's going to believe us," he said quietly. "They'll think we're making it up. Or worse, they'll think we're crazy." I didn't argue. Deep down, I knew he was right. Even I wasn't sure if I believed what I'd just seen, and I was there. My mind kept replaying the image of Mrs. Mallow's sagging skin, the hollow look in her eyes, the way she moved like a broken doll. "Let's just go home," Ethan said, his voice weak. "I don't want to be out here anymore." We started walking back toward Josh's house, none of us saying much. The excitement of the night had been sucked out of us. The candy in our bags didn't matter anymore, and the thrill of Halloween felt far away, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread that clung to my chest. The aftermath. When we got back to Josh's house, his parents were still in full party mode. They didn't even notice the looks on our faces as we slipped upstairs to Josh's room. We didn't talk about the Mallow house. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. We just lay there in our sleeping bags, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold something darker, something waiting. I kept seeing Mrs. Mallow's face in my mind, that twisted, contorted expression frozen in time. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, her body jerking unnaturally as she moved toward us. When the morning finally came, the sunlight didn't chase away the unease. We all left Josh's house early, none of us saying much. Ethan made an excuse about having to help his dad with yard work, but I knew he just wanted to leave. Josh barely said goodbye, still shaken by the events of the night before. I walked home, my feet dragging along the sidewalk, the cold autumn air doing little to clear my head. The world felt heavier, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, something we weren't supposed to see. My thoughts kept going back to the Mallow house, to the way Mrs. Mallow had moved, to the way Mr. Mallow had said, "We've been waiting." Waiting for what? The final twist. A week later, the news came. Mr. and Mrs. Mallow were dead. The neighbors had noticed a foul smell coming from the house, and when they called the police to check on the couple, they found Mr. Mallow dead in his chair. The coroner said he had been dead for weeks, but Mrs. Mallow, they found her body upstairs. The coroner said she had been dead for over a year. I couldn't believe it. None of us could. We had seen her. She had moved. She had been alive, or at least something had been moving inside that house. But the reports didn't lie. Mrs. Mallow had been dead for a long time. We didn't talk about it after that. Josh, Ethan and I tried to go back to normal, but the memory of that night lingered, hanging over us like a dark cloud. We avoided Franklin Street, avoided talking about Halloween altogether. The Mallow house was boarded up after that, left to rot. No one ever went near it again. It became a place of whispered stories, a legend that kids would tell each other on Halloween nights, daring one another to go near it. But I knew the truth. We all did. That night changed something in me. I never went trick-or-treating again after that. It was like Halloween had lost its magic for me. What used to be a night of fun and excitement had turned into something darker, something that I didn't want to revisit. The thrill of wearing costumes and collecting candy had been replaced by the image of Mrs. Mallow's hollow eyes and the way her body had moved as though it defied nature itself. The weeks that followed were strange. Josh, Ethan, and I didn't hang out as much anymore. It wasn't that we had stopped being friends, but there was this unspoken tension between us. It was as if talking about that night would somehow make it real again, like saying it out loud would bring back the terror we had tried so hard to bury. We all silently agreed to pretend it hadn't happened, to pretend that the Mallow house was just another creepy house on Franklin Street. But deep down, we knew better. I couldn't get it out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see Mrs. Mallow, her twisted body crawling across the floor, her skin sagging and decaying, her mouth hanging open as that gurgling sound escaped her throat. The image would flash behind my eyelids whenever I tried to sleep, jolting me awake in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat. I'd lie there in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my heart pounding, listening to the creaks of my own house. Every sound, the wind against the windows, the groan of the wooden floors, made my pulse quicken. I was always on edge, half expecting to see her standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those dead, hollow eyes. The town moves on. As the months passed, the town moved on. People talked about the Mallows for a while, whispered stories about how strange they were, how no one had seen Mrs. Mallow in years. Some said Mr. Mallow had gone crazy living in that house alone, hiding the fact that his wife had died. Others said the house itself was cursed, but eventually the talk faded, and life in our small town returned to normal. The Mallow house was boarded up. No one bought it, no one tore it down. It just sat there at the end of Franklin Street, rotting away, its windows dark and empty, its yard overgrown with weeds and tangled branches. It became part of the background, a place that kids would dare each other to approach, but never actually go near. It was as if the house itself had become a ghost, a relic of something terrible that the town chose to ignore. But for me, it was impossible to forget. Every year, as Halloween approached, I'd feel that familiar chill creeping up my spine. The decorations would start going up around town, kids would excitedly plan their costumes, and the air would take on that cool, crisp bite of autumn. But I couldn't enjoy it like I used to. Halloween had become a reminder of that night, of the terror we'd faced, and of the things that still haunted me. The night I couldn't escape. A year after that fateful Halloween, I was sitting in my room on a chilly October evening, flipping through an old comic book, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that were creeping back in. Halloween was just a few days away, and the familiar excitement that I used to feel was nowhere to be found. My mum knocked on my door, poking her head in. "Son, are you going out with Josh and Ethan for Halloween this year?" she asked with a smile, clearly unaware of the tension that had grown between us since last year. I shook my head. "Nah, I'm staying in this year. I'm too old for trick-or-treating now." She gave me a curious look but didn't push. "Okay, well, there's some candy downstairs if you change your mind or just want a snack." "Thanks, Mum," I muttered, my eyes still on the comic book. She left, and I sat there for a while, staring at the pages without really reading them. My mind kept wandering back to the Mallow house, to that moment when Mrs. Mallow had crawled toward us. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. That night, as I lay in bed, the house was unusually quiet. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the branches of the tree next to my window. I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to focus on the comforting sounds of the house settling for the night. But then I heard it. A faint creaking sound like floorboards shifting under pressure. At first I told myself it was just the house, that I was imagining things because I'd been thinking about the Mallow house all night. But then the creaking got louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was coming from just outside my door, as if someone, or something, was standing in the hallway. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the crack of light under the door. The creaking stopped, but my heart continued to race. I was frozen, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen. And then softly I heard it, a wet gurgling sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was there. That same gurgling noise that Mrs. Mallow had made as she crawled toward us that night. I threw the covers off and bolted out of bed, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with light, but the noise was gone. The house was silent again. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I stood there in the middle of my room, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I slowly made my way to the door and opened it, peeking out into the dark hallway. It was empty. The house was still. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that no matter how far I tried to run from it, the memory of the Mallow house would never leave me. The haunting memory. Years later, I still think about that night. I think about how different things might have been if we hadn't gone to the Mallow house, if we hadn't dared to knock on that door. I try to tell myself that it was just a freak occurrence, that what we saw wasn't real. But deep down, I know better. The Mallow house wasn't haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense. It was haunted by something much darker, something that existed between life and death, something that had reached out to us that night and left its mark on us. Josh, Ethan, and I drifted apart as we got older. We never spoke about that Halloween again, and I think part of us knew we never would. Some things are too terrifying to revisit. But every Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves begin to fall, I can't help but think about the Mallows, about the house at the end of Franklin Street, and about the way Mrs. Mallow's body moved like it was being pulled by invisible strings. I can still hear the sound of her joints cracking, the wet gurgling that filled the air as she crawled toward us. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the house creaks with age, I'll hear that sound again, the faint, distant creak of floorboards. And for just a moment, I'll be 13 again, standing on the porch of the Mallow house, staring into the dark, knowing that something is waiting for me inside. And it still terrifies me. That Halloween night was the last time I ever felt truly scared. Before I start this story, I want to say something important. If you ever feel like someone is watching you, and you can't be sure who they are or even if they're real, trust me, they are. They're watching, waiting, and wanting. You may not see them, but they see you. My therapist has told me over and over again that this was all in my head. He says I imagined everything, that I was just hurting myself by believing in things that weren't real. But I don't believe him. He only says what they want him to say. For as long as I can remember, I felt like someone or something was watching me. I could never shake that feeling. It was always there, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Growing up, I was homeschooled while all my friends went to public school. Despite this, I spent a lot of time hanging out with the boys in my neighborhood. We would all meet in the woods behind Mr. Buchman's house. Mr. Buchman was a Vietnam veteran, and we always joked that he was a real-life Rambo. He owned about 10 acres of forest, and he didn't mind us playing on his land. We played games like tree tag and superheroes during the day, and at night we tried to scare each other. We usually stayed close to the tree line so no one would get lost. There were 5 of us who regularly hung out: Tommy Harbinger, Billy Legions, Bradley Russo, Martin Russo, and me, Jacob Barnes. Tommy was short with green eyes and bright red hair. He cared way too much about what he wore for someone our age. He only wore Nike clothes, and his white Air Forces were always spotless, like he had just bought them that day. Billy was even shorter than Tommy. He had blue eyes and messy black hair, and he looked like a character straight out of Toy Story, the kind of kid who wore skull shirts and black clothes all the time. Billy wasn't exactly the cleanest kid. He smelled like he never showered and used dead animals as deodorant. Then there were the Russo brothers, Bradley and Martin. They looked almost identical. Both had rare grey eyes and always reminded us of how uncommon their eye colour was. They had short buzz cuts, and from a distance, they almost looked bald. The brothers were taller than the rest of us, and they wouldn't let us forget it. They liked to act like they were country boys, but they weren't as tough as they thought they were. They always wore matching overalls and cowboy boots, which looked ridiculous together. The funny thing is, they grew up to be ranchers. Later on, they both cheated on their wives with each other's wives. Sadly, Martin died in a tractor accident a few years ago. I don't remember exactly how old I was when Mr. Bushman passed away, but I was probably around 11 or 12. After his death, we stopped playing in the woods and started hanging out at the Russo brothers' house. Their house was bigger, and since they were the only siblings in our group, we figured it was fair to hang out there. Plus, Their mum was really attractive, and that didn't go unnoticed. Things started to change. After we moved to the Russo house, things started to change. Bradley and Martin used to be the easiest ones to scare, but once we began hanging out at their place, they became the hardest to frighten. They were more comfortable in their own home, and it made them braver. This shift in power made them unbearable. They would ruin our attempts to scare each other, turn on the lights when they weren't supposed to, and never stop bragging about how not scared they were. One week in November, both Bradley and Martin got sick. Tommy and Billy joked that they got sick at the same time because they bathed together, but that was never confirmed. With the Russo brothers out of commission, the rest of us gathered to plot our next move. We wanted to plan the ultimate scare for when they got better. They were always scared of the woods behind Mr. Buckman's house, Billy said with a grin that stretched way too wide. I stared at Billy, confused by the unnatural way his mouth moved. "Why are you smiling like that?" I asked. Billy sat across from me in his dad's living room, staring at me with his dark brown eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He leaned forward, drool gathering on his lower lip, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. It was like everything that had ever scared me was about to close in. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the washing machine, and even the wind pressing against the house. It all felt louder, more intense, and for a moment, I was sure that the person who had been watching me my whole life had finally found me. Then, just as suddenly, Billy and Tommy burst out laughing. "You should have seen your face," Billy wheezed through his laughter. Tommy couldn't stop giggling either. Feeling embarrassed, I stood up, spun around twice, and slapped myself on the back of my neck, a silly punishment we'd do to admit defeat, but I wasn't going to give up the scare. "What if we tell them Mr. Buckman's house is haunted?" I suggested. Their laughter stopped instantly, and they looked at me with wide, excited eyes, like I had just come up with the best idea ever. "Then we could lead them there for a test of courage," I continued. "We can set up a bunch of scares ahead of time and freak them out." Tommy, always the cautious one, squinted with his left eye nearly closed, which meant he was nervous. "What if someone catches us? What if we get in trouble?" Billy, ignoring Tommy's worries, jumped in. "We could even do a séance or something. We could pretend to summon Mr. Buckman's ghost." "But we don't have anything to summon a ghost with," I pointed out. Billy looked disappointed, his earlier excitement fading. "Yeah, I guess we don't." Then Tommy brightened up. "I have a Bluetooth speaker. We could use it to play spooky sounds." With our plan coming together, we spent the next few days preparing. We went to the Spirit Halloween store, which was closing for the season, and bought as many fake spiderwebs as we could afford. Billy and Tommy pooled their allowances to cover the cost, while I spent all my money on cheap candles to add to the creepy atmosphere. We set everything up at Mr. Buckman's house, the speakers, the candles, the fake spiderwebs, and it looked perfect. I think this was the moment I realized I wanted to become an electrician one day, because I enjoyed rigging up all the lights and sounds. The house was eerie, especially after dark, and we were ready to scare the pants off Bradley and Martin. The night of the plan. When the Russo twins finally recovered, they were reluctant to go to the haunted house. Bradley seemed the most hesitant. "I'm not going in there," he said, shivering in the cold. He stood under the only streetlight, looking small and scared. Before I could respond, I heard a voice. It was faint, distant, and I couldn't tell where it came from. "Don't stop," it said. My blood ran cold. I didn't know if I imagined it, but the voice sent a shiver down my spine. Billy, of course, took the opportunity to tease Bradley. "Oh, what's this? The big bad Bradley is scared." "I'm not scared," Bradley shot back, though his voice wavered. "It's just cold, that's all." "Sure it is," Billy said with a smirk. "But you can stay behind if you want." Bradley, not wanting to seem like a coward, reluctantly got back on his bike and followed us to the house. As we rode, the feeling of being watched returned. It was stronger this time, like someone was right behind me, but every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing, just the dark streets lit by the occasional street lamp. When we reached Mr. Buckman's house, something was different. There were strange markings on the door, carvings that looked like a roaring lion. I hadn't seen them the last time we were there, and it unsettled me. "When did you guys come back to do this?" I whispered to Billy, not wanting the twins to hear. "We didn't," Billy whispered back, his voice laced with confusion. As we stepped inside, I knew something was very wrong. Eyes. Hundreds of them were carved into the walls. Everywhere I looked, there was a faintly etched eye staring back at me. It was Tommy and me in the front, with the Russo brothers in the middle and Billy at the rear. I leaned toward Tommy and whispered, "Did you carve those eyes into the walls?" Tommy shook his head, his face pale. "What eyes?" That's when I realized this wasn't part of the plan anymore. We pushed forward, reaching the living room, where a fake goat's head sat surrounded by fake blood. But as soon as we saw it, Tommy, Billy, and I all screamed. The head and blood weren't part of our setup. Someone, or something else, had been in the house. I should have turned and left right then, but for some reason we kept going. We moved into the next room, where we saw a figure hanging from the ceiling. It was a strange rabbit-like creature, dripping with a thick, red liquid that pooled beneath it on the floor. The rabbit had horns on one side of its head and antlers on the other, as though they had grown out of its skull. The creature's body was covered in what looked like blood, and the liquid kept dripping, forming an unnerving, oblong puddle beneath it. There was way too much blood for such a small figure to produce. I could barely move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor as I stared at the grotesque figure swaying slightly from the ceiling. Billy, who had been the boldest of us, now looked pale. Did one of you guys do this?" His voice cracked as he asked, glancing nervously at me and Tommy. "No way," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. "We didn't put that there." None of us had done this, and now it was obvious. Something far more disturbing was happening, something none of us could explain. We stayed there, frozen for a moment, just staring at the hanging figure and the blood on the floor. The only sound in the room was the slow drip of the red liquid, plopping into the puddle below. My heart was racing in my chest, my mouth dry, and I could feel the goosebumps crawling up my arms. "Maybe we should leave," I finally suggested, my voice shaking. Billy was already nodding in agreement, his bravado completely gone. "Yeah, this isn't funny anymore. We should get out of here." But something strange happened at that moment. Bradley, the one who had been the most reluctant to come, suddenly stepped forward. "No, let's go to the next room. I want to see what else is here." I stared at him, shocked. Just a few minutes ago, Bradley had been shaking under a streetlight, too scared to come with us. Now he was leading the way deeper into the house. It didn't make sense, but before any of us could argue, he pushed open the next door, leading into what used to be Mr. Buckman's study. As soon as we entered the room, the air changed. It felt thick, heavy, like we were walking into something we weren't supposed to disturb. The smell hit us next, a strong metallic odor mixed with something sour and rotten. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying not to gag, and glanced at the others. They all looked as uneasy as I felt. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the candles we had set up earlier cast flickering shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a circle of candles, their flames dancing wildly, even though there was no wind. Inside the circle was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. It looked like a person. No, more like a twisted version of a person, hunched over, with elongated limbs and an unsettling grin carved into its face. "What the hell is this?" Tommy muttered, stepping closer to the circle, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I answered, feeling the pit in my stomach grow deeper. This wasn't part of the plan. Billy, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "Guys, I think we need to get out of here. This is bad, really bad." For once, we were all in agreement. We turned around to leave, but just as we reached the door, we heard a loud thud behind us. It sounded like something heavy had hit the floor. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my ears. The rabbit figure that had been hanging from the ceiling was now on the floor, lying in a pool of its own blood. But that wasn't the worst part. The eyes that had been carved into the walls earlier. They were glowing, faint, eerie glows, like something was watching us from every direction. And then the creaking started again, the same sound we had heard earlier when we first entered the house. Only this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs, it was coming from right behind us. I felt my skin crawl as I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, anything, in the shadows. But there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the candles, and that awful wooden figurine grinning up at us from the center of the floor. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now." We rushed for the door, our feet pounding on the wooden floor as we stumbled out of the study. My heart raced as we made our way through the hallway, back toward the front door. The house seemed darker now, more oppressive, like it was closing in on us. The eyes on the walls seemed to follow us, watching our every move as we hurried to escape. But just as we reached the front door, Bradley stopped. "Wait." We all froze, turning to look at him. "Bradley, what are you doing?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with panic. Bradley's face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Don't you hear it?" he asked, his voice distant, like he was in some kind of trance. "Hear what?" Billy snapped, his patience gone. "There's nothing here. Let's go." But Bradley shook his head. "No, listen, it's calling us." And then I heard it. A faint, whispering voice. It was so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as I strained to listen, the voice grew clearer. It was coming from somewhere deep inside the house, calling out to us. "Come back," the voice whispered. "Stay with us." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, on the street. The voice I thought I had imagined. But it was real. It was coming from inside the house, and it wanted us to stay. Without another word, I grabbed Bradley by the arm and yanked him toward the door. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "Now." This time he didn't resist. We all ran out of the house, slamming the door behind us as we jumped on our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could down the street. I didn't look back. None of us did. We just rode in silence, the wind howling in our ears, the feeling of being watched following us all the way home. The aftermath. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, too scared to close my eyes. My mind kept replaying everything that had happened at Mr. Buchmann's house, the eyes on the walls, the rabbit figure, the voice. But the thing that haunted me most was the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Even now, in my room, I felt like I was still being watched. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, and worse, I felt them. Watching, waiting. We never talked about what happened that night again. After that, we stopped hanging out as much. The Russo brothers never mentioned it, and Tommy and Billy acted like it had never happened. But I knew better. Something had changed that night, something none of us wanted to admit. I don't know what we stumbled into, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. But one thing is certain. Something was in that house, something that saw us, and I have a feeling it never stopped watching. If you ever feel like someone is watching you, but you can't tell who they are or if they're even real, trust me, they are watching, waiting, wanting. Before I dive into my story, I want to mention that my therapist keeps telling me it's all in my head. He claims I'm just hurting myself by believing in things that aren't real, but I don't believe him. He only says what they want him to say. My whole life I've always felt like something or someone has been watching me. It's always there, like a shadow that never leaves. I was homeschooled while all my friends went to public school. The boys in my neighborhood and I often hung out in the woods behind Mr. Buchmann's house. Mr. Buchmann was a Vietnam veteran, and we joked that he was a real-life Rambo. He owned about 10 acres of woods, and he didn't mind us playing there. We played games like tree tag and superheroes during the day and tried to scare each other at night. We usually stayed close to the tree line to avoid getting lost. There were 5 of us who usually hung out: Tommy Harbinger, Billy Legions, Bradley Russo, Martin Russo, and me, Jacob Barnes. Tommy was short, with bright green eyes and fiery red hair. He cared too much about fashion for a kid. He wore Nike clothes all the time and kept his white Air Forces spotless, like they were brand new. Billy was even shorter, with messy black hair and piercing blue eyes. He dressed all in black and wore a skull shirt that made him look like he jumped out of a movie. He never washed his clothes and smelled awful, like he used dead animals as deodorant. Then there were the Russo twins, Bradley and Martin. They looked nearly identical, both with short blonde hair and grey eyes that they bragged about being rare. They were taller than the rest of us and never let us forget it. They wore matching overalls and cowboy boots, even though they didn't look good together. They grew up to become ranchers and had some wild stories to tell, but they also made some bad choices. I don't remember exactly how old I was when Mr. Buchmann died, but I was around 11 or 12. After his death, we started hanging out at the Russo house. It was bigger, and we thought it was fair since they were the only brothers in our group. Plus, their mum was really pretty. A change in hangouts. At the Russo house, everything changed. Bradley and Martin used to be the easiest to scare, but now that we were in their home, they acted brave. They became unbearable, ruining our attempts to scare each other, turning on the lights when they weren't supposed to, and constantly bragging about how unafraid they were. In November, Bradley and Martin got sick. Tommy and Billy joked that they caught it because they bathed together, which was never confirmed. With the twins out of the picture, we plotted how to scare them when they got better. They were always scared in Mr. Buckman's woods, Billy said, grinning mischievously. I looked at Billy, puzzled by the weird smile on his face. Why are you smiling like that? Billy sat across from me in his dad's living room, staring with intense brown eyes. He leaned forward, drool forming on his lower lip, and I felt uneasy. It was like everything that scared me was about to close in. The ticking clock, the whirring washing machine, even the wind against the house felt louder, as if something sinister was lurking. Then Billy and Tommy erupted into laughter. "You should have seen your face," they both shouted. Embarrassed, I stood up and spun around twice, slapping the back of my neck as a punishment. "We should tell them Mr. Buckman's house is haunted." They stopped laughing and stared at me with excitement in their eyes, like I had just suggested the best idea ever. "Then we could lead them there for a test of courage," I said. "We can set up a bunch of scares to freak them out." "But what if someone catches us?" Tommy asked, looking nervous. I could tell he was scared because his left eye almost closed completely, showing only a sliver of green. He was always the sensible one, and now I could see why. Billy ignored him and blurted out, "We could do a séance. We could ask Mr. Buckman to talk to us." "Do any of us even have a projector?" I asked, excited about the idea. The other two shook their heads. "I guess I got too ahead of myself," Billy said, looking disappointed. Tommy's face lit up. "I have a Bluetooth speaker. We could use that instead." He looked at me, clearly wondering why I was still staring at Billy. With the plan taking shape, we spent the next few days preparing. We visited the Spirit Halloween store before it closed for the season and bought fake spiderwebs and other decorations. Tommy and Billy pooled their allowances to cover the costs, while I spent my money on cheap candles to create the right atmosphere. Once we set everything up at Mr. Buckman's house, the speakers, the candles, the spiderwebs, we were ready to scare the Russo twins. I felt excited, maybe even a little bit proud. The house looked eerie, especially after dark, and I was ready to finally give them a good scare. The big night. When the twins finally recovered, they hesitated to go to the haunted house. Bradley stood under the streetlight, shivering. "I'm not going in there," he said, looking scared. "Don't be a baby," Billy taunted, trying to get a rise out of him. "I'm not scared, it's just cold," Bradley snapped back, but I could see he was lying. "Okay, then we'll leave you here," Billy said, feigning indifference. Bradley reluctantly got back on his bike and followed us. As we rode, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was an unsettling feeling, as if someone or something was lurking behind us. I didn't want to mention it. I knew they'd just tease me. When we reached Mr. Buckman's house, it looked different. Strange markings were carved into the door, resembling a roaring lion. I hadn't seen those before, and it made me uneasy. "When did you guys come back to do this?" I whispered to Billy. "We didn't," he replied, confusion clear in his voice. As we entered the house, I knew something was wrong. All around me, faintly carved eyes appeared in the walls. Everywhere I looked, I could see eyes watching me. "Did you carve those eyes into the walls?" I asked Tommy in a hushed tone. "What eyes?" he replied, bewildered. I felt a knot in my stomach. We pressed on to the living room, where a fake goat's head surrounded by fake blood greeted us. But instead of laughter, all three of us screamed. The goat head wasn't part of our decorations. It was terrifyingly real. If I had known what was coming, I would have turned back immediately. But we continued into the next room. There, hanging from the ceiling, was a strange rabbit-like figurine dripping with a thick red liquid. The puddle on the floor grew larger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Billy, who had been the bravest, now looked terrified. "What is this?" he whispered, backing away. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of dread settle in my stomach. This wasn't part of the plan. As we debated whether to leave, I noticed Bradley stepping forward. No, we should see what else is in here, he said, his eyes wide with curiosity. Bradley, wait! I shouted, but he was already moving deeper into the house. When we reached the next room, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thicker, heavy with dread. A horrible smell hit us, something rotten mixed with the scent of burning. I had to cover my nose as we entered. In the center of the room was a circle of candles, their flames flickering wildly. Inside the circle was a small, twisted figurine that resembled a person, hunched over and grinning grotesquely. I could feel my heart racing, the fear rising in my chest. Then, suddenly, a loud thud echoed from behind us. The rabbit figure that had been hanging from the ceiling dropped to the floor, landing in a pool of blood. The eyes carved into the walls began to glow, illuminating the room with an eerie light. I felt my skin crawl. "We need to get out of here!" I shouted, panic rising in my voice. We sprinted for the door, but before we could reach it, we heard a whispering voice. "Stay with us." I froze, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The voice was chilling, and I could feel it deep in my bones. "What is happening?" I gasped, looking around at my friends, all of us equally terrified. "Go, go, go!" Tommy shouted, his fear propelling us forward as we barreled out of the house and jumped on our bikes. We pedaled furiously, not daring to look back. The aftermath. Once we were safely away from Mr. Buckman's house, I finally slowed down. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could still hear that whisper echoing in my mind. We didn't say anything as we rode home, the silence thick with tension. The adrenaline of the scare mixed with the chilling atmosphere from the house made it hard to breathe. When I finally reached home, I threw my bike down in the yard and rushed inside. My parents were watching TV, completely oblivious to the storm of fear swirling inside me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the image of those glowing eyes and the whispering voice wouldn't leave my mind. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My room felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking just out of sight. I couldn't even close my eyes without seeing the rabbit figure or hearing the voice that told us to stay. The next day at school, everything felt different. I walked through the hallways, and it was like I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on me, as if they all knew what had happened at the house. But when I met up with Tommy and Billy, they seemed fine, like nothing had happened. "Did you guys freak out last night?" Tommy asked with a smirk, as if trying to lighten the mood. "Dude, that was scary as hell," Billy chimed in, laughing a little. "You should have seen your faces." I forced a smile, but inside I felt like I was carrying a heavy weight. "Yeah, it was pretty crazy," I admitted, "but we should probably stay away from that house for a while." Tommy and Billy exchanged glances, their expressions turning serious. "I'm not going back there," Tommy said firmly. "Not after what we saw." Billy nodded, looking a bit pale. "I don't think I can handle it again. Let's just find something else to do." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe if we avoided the house, we could forget about the incident. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that avoiding it wasn't enough to erase the memory. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The watchful eyes. No matter where I went, I felt as though someone was always there, lurking in the shadows. At school, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye. It got to the point where I was jumpy all the time, and my friends started to notice. "Are you okay, Jake?" Tommy asked one afternoon after I flinched at the sound of a locker slamming shut. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied quickly, but I knew I was lying. I was far from fine. Billy leaned in, his voice low. "You know that stuff we saw at the house?" I can't stop thinking about it either. What if it was real? "Shut up, Billy," Tommy snapped. "You're scaring him. It was just a stupid prank, right, Jake?" I nodded, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It felt like we had awakened something in that house, and it was still watching us. Weeks passed, and as winter turned to spring, the unease never faded. I stopped going out with Tommy and Billy as much, spending more time alone. I didn't want to burden them with my fears. I started isolating myself, replaying the events in my mind over and over, trying to find some kind of answer. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a soft knock on my window. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. It came again, a gentle tap, tap, tap. I forced myself to get out of bed and peek through the curtain. To my shock, there stood Bradley, looking pale and frantic. I opened the window slowly, and he immediately blurted out, "Jake, you have to come with me. It's happening again." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Come on, just trust me," he urged, glancing around nervously, as if he were afraid someone would see him. I hesitated, but something in his eyes told me I couldn't ignore him. I nodded and climbed out of the window, following him into the night. The return to the house. We raced back to Mr. Buckman's house, the familiar path through the woods feeling both comforting and terrifying. The shadows danced around us, and the branches scratched at my skin like fingers trying to pull me back. "What's going on, Bradley?" I asked as we reached the front of the house. "I don't know how to explain it. Just, you need to see for yourself," he said, looking terrified but determined. As we entered the house, I felt a chill sweep through me. The air was thick with tension, and the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. My heart raced as we moved through the hallway, the carved eyes on the walls glaring down at us. We stepped into the living room, and my breath caught in my throat. There, sitting in the center of the room, was the same rabbit figure we had seen before, but this time it was surrounded by more candles, and the blood seemed to be flowing as if it were alive. "What the hell is happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Bradley didn't respond. He looked around, his eyes wide, as if he were searching for something. "It's here," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could ask what he meant, I heard the voice again. "Stay with us." It echoed through the room, sending chills down my spine. "What is this?" I shouted, backing away. "What do you want from us?" A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, and I turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a tall, ghostly shape with hollow eyes, staring directly at me. I froze in terror, my heart pounding against my ribcage. "Leave us alone!" Bradley yelled, stepping in front of me, trying to protect me. But the figure only moved closer, its gaze fixed on me. In that moment, I felt a rush of panic. This wasn't just a prank or a trick. Something dark and sinister was happening, and it wanted me. I turned to run, grabbing Bradley's arm and pulling him with me. "Go, go!" I shouted, and we bolted for the door. The voice followed us, echoing in my mind. "Stay with us." We burst outside, gasping for breath. The night air felt sharp against my skin, and I stumbled, looking back at the house. The figure stood at the door, watching us, and I could feel its gaze burning into my soul. "Did you see that?" Bradley gasped, his face pale with fear. "Yes, I saw it," I replied, trembling. "What was that?" "I don't know, but we can't go back there," he said, shaking his head. The escape. We ran as fast as we could, the fear propelling us through the dark woods. Every sound, every rustle made my heart race faster. The shadows seemed to reach out, trying to grab us, but we didn't stop until we were safely back in town. When we finally slowed down, I could barely catch my breath. "What just happened?" I panted, trying to make sense of everything. Bradley looked shaken. I think whatever is in that house is connected to us now. It knows we're afraid, and it feeds on that fear." "Then what do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest again. "We can't just ignore it." "We need to tell someone," he said firmly. "We can't let it get to anyone else." But who would believe us? Would the police take us seriously, or would they just think we were kids trying to scare everyone? "I don't know if anyone would listen," I admitted, feeling hopeless. "We have to try," he insisted. And so we did. The next day we went to the police station, our hearts racing as we explained everything to the officer on duty. He listened with a skeptical expression, but he took our statements. After a while, he promised to send someone to check out the house. As we left the station, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could put an end to whatever was haunting that place. The final confrontation. Days passed, and we waited anxiously for any news. The police hadn't found anything unusual at Mr. Buckman's house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity inside was still there, watching, waiting. One night as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. "Stay with us." I sat up, terrified, and glanced out my window. The house was dark, but I felt that familiar chill creeping over me. Before I could think, I grabbed my jacket and ran out of the house, heading back to Mr. Buchmann's place. Bradley had to come with me. I needed him to see this too. When we arrived, the door creaked open as if inviting us in. "Are you ready?" I asked, my heart pounding. He nodded, steeling himself as we stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. "Stay with us." We moved through the house, determination pushing us forward. In the living room, the rabbit figure was back, surrounded by candles that flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows around the room. As we stepped closer, I noticed something different about the figurine. It seemed to be pulsating, almost alive, with the red liquid pooling beneath it. The candles flickered more violently now, as if they sensed our presence. "What do you think it wants?" I whispered to Bradley, who was pale and trembling beside me. "I think it wants us to join it," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't let that happen." "Let's just destroy it," I suggested, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Maybe that will stop whatever is happening here." Bradley nodded, and we quickly searched for something we could use. There was a rusty metal pipe leaning against the wall. I grabbed it, feeling its weight in my hands. "This will work," I said, looking at Bradley for confirmation. He looked uncertain, but he nodded anyway. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the figurine. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices urging me to stay, to become one with the darkness. I raised the pipe high above my head, preparing to strike. But just before I brought it down, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in an instant. Darkness enveloped us, and the whispers turned into frantic screams, echoing in my mind. "Jake!" Bradley shouted, panic lacing his voice. "What's happening?" "I don't know!" I yelled back, my heart racing as I struggled to see anything in the thick blackness. I could feel the presence closing in around us, a weight pressing down on my chest. In that moment of chaos, I felt a sharp pain in my side, as if something had pierced my skin. I gasped, instinctively dropping the pipe as I stumbled back. "What was that?" I cried, looking around frantically. "Let's get out of here," Bradley yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the force of the entity behind us, pushing us to leave. We burst out of the house, gasping for fresh air as we raced into the night. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched intensified. "What just happened?" I asked, panting heavily as we reached the edge of the property. "I don't know," Bradley replied, his voice shaking, "but we have to warn everyone. This isn't over." The reckoning. The next day, we gathered our friends and told them everything. I could see doubt in their eyes, but we were determined to make them understand. We all drove to the police station, and with trembling voices, we recounted our experiences at Mr. Buckman's house. The officers listened, some skeptical, but a few took us seriously. They agreed to send a team to investigate the house again. I felt a spark of hope. Maybe we could finally put an end to whatever darkness lurked there. After a few hours, the police returned to the station, and my heart sank as I noticed their expressions. They hadn't found anything unusual. They suggested that we might have been imagining things or playing pranks on each other. It felt like the universe was laughing at us. "That can't be right," Bradley shouted, frustration boiling over. "We saw it. We felt it. It's real." The officer remained calm, but I could tell he was annoyed. "Look, kids, if you see something else, come back and let us know. Until then, we can't act on vague claims." Disheartened, we left the station, unsure of what to do next. I felt hopeless, like the darkness in that house was winning. Days turned into weeks, and I began to isolate myself again, staying home and avoiding my friends. The weight of fear hung over me like a cloud that refused to clear. The final push. One night I received a text from Bradley, asking me to meet him at Mr. Buckman's house. I hesitated at first, but the desperation in his message compelled me to go. When I arrived, I found him standing outside, pacing nervously. "Jake, we have to go in. I think I found a way to destroy whatever is in there," he said, determination shining in his eyes. "Are you sure? After everything that happened?" I asked, fear gripping my chest. "Yes, but we need to act fast. I think the presence is growing stronger. I've been doing some research, and I think we can use salt to weaken it," he explained. "Salt?" I raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "Yeah, it's supposed to purify spaces and keep spirits away. We need to cover that rabbit figure with salt," he said, his voice steady. We gathered our courage and entered the house again. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as we moved through the darkened rooms. I felt the familiar sensation of being watched, and the whispers returned, echoing in my ears, trying to distract me. When we reached the living room, the rabbit figure stood waiting, its presence more sinister than ever. The eyes on the walls glowed ominously, filling the room with a sense of dread. "Quick, let's do this!" Bradley shouted as he poured salt around the figure, forming a protective circle. As soon as the salt touched the rabbit, the room shook violently. The whispers turned into furious screams. and I felt an overwhelming force pushing against us. "Keep going!" Bradley yelled, panic rising in his voice. "Don't stop!" We poured salt over the figure, and as the last bit fell, the room erupted in a blinding light. I shielded my eyes, feeling the energy crackle around us. The screams intensified, a chorus of voices pleading for release. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos ceased. The room fell silent, and the glowing eyes on the walls faded away. The air felt lighter, almost welcoming. "What just happened?" I asked, panting heavily as I looked around. I think we did it," Bradley whispered, disbelief in his eyes. Freedom at last. In that moment, I felt a rush of relief wash over me. It was finally over. The weight I had been carrying for so long lifted, and I knew I was free from the darkness that had haunted me. We left the house, our hearts lighter than they had been in ages. The feeling of being watched faded as we stepped into the moonlight. I looked back at the house one last time, and for the first time, I felt no fear. "Let's never come back here again," I said, feeling grateful to leave that chapter of my life behind. Bradley nodded in agreement. "Agreed. We made it through, and now we can finally move on." As we walked away, I realized that I could leave my hometown behind. Not just physically, but mentally too. The nightmares that had tormented me were finally gone, and I felt hopeful for the first time in years. Whatever had watched me was now vanquished, and I was free to live my life without the shadows of my past haunting me. I knew I could finally find peace. Dad was drunk again. The rain poured down in relentless sheets, slapping against the windshield like angry fists as I maneuvered the car along the winding road. The rhythmic sound of droplets hitting the glass was almost hypnotic, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in my mind. Dad sat in the passenger seat, a shadow of his former self, his head lolling against the window as he stared out into the darkness. His eyes were glassy, shimmering with unshed tears that seemed to reflect the storm outside. I had spent countless nights like this, driving him home from yet another bar where he had made a spectacle of himself. He wasn't the brawler type. No, my father was the kind of drunk who wore his heart on his sleeve. He'd sit at the bar, pouring out his emotions like cheap liquor, sobbing over lost dreams and missed opportunities. If only things had gone differently, he'd lament, his words slurred and heavy with sorrow. Even now, I could hear him sniffling, his breath hitching as he drifted between lucidity and incoherence. "This would have been our anniversary," he muttered, his voice thick with regret. "Dad, we've been over this," I replied, forcing a steadiness into my tone. "Mum's gone. You need to let it go." But he was lost in his grief, a haze of alcohol clouding his mind. As I drove, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, a mixture of frustration and sadness. I was only 16, but I had become the adult in our relationship, the one holding everything together. I had to be the rock, the caregiver, while he crumbled under the weight of his own sorrow. The road traveled parallel to our town's only river, a dark and winding body of water that the local kids referred to as the Devil's Gutter. It twisted and turned through the trees, almost taunting us as it snaked out of view. There was a certain nostalgia tied to that river, a twisted fondness that stirred something deep within me. It had been a backdrop for our childhood adventures, a mysterious place where danger lurked beneath the surface. At first glance, the river seemed harmless, shallow enough in some places to leap across. But those who dared to underestimate it learned quickly that the Devil's Gutter was a treacherous force. It concealed depths that could swallow even the strongest swimmer, its undercurrents more powerful than anyone could imagine. Over the years, it had claimed lives, mostly reckless teenagers daring each other to jump, only to find themselves pulled under by the dark current. The river was woven into our town's folklore. We often recounted the tale of Bart O'Neill, a prospector who had mysteriously vanished after reportedly tossing his kittens into the gutter. Legend said that when they found his body, it was covered in claw marks. It was a crude invention of schoolchildren, but somewhere buried within it lay a chilling truth. Bart was real, and he had truly disappeared. The thought of Bart O'Neill haunted me, much like the memory of my mother. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts of ghosts and rivers that never revealed their secrets. But as my eyes caught another glimpse of the Devil's Gutter, I couldn't help but think of the stories that had shaped our childhood. Memories and regrets. "Jake!" Dad suddenly groaned, his voice bringing me back to the present. "Why can't I just be with her?" His words slurred together, blending with the patter of rain on the roof. "Because she's gone, Dad," I snapped, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to stop this. You can't keep drowning yourself in the past." He shrank back against the seat, visibly hurt by my words, and I felt a pang of guilt. How many times had I said something similar? The anniversary of her death was always hard for him, but I had long since come to terms with the loss of my mother. Why couldn't he? The road became a blur, each bend echoing with memories. I recalled that New Year's Eve when he had been particularly unbearable, drunk out of his mind while I tried to drive us home. I had to dodge other cars, swerving dangerously, my heart racing as I kept my focus on the road ahead. "Do you remember the time we went camping?" Dad asked suddenly, his voice a soft whisper, almost as if he were lost in his own memories. "You were so scared of the dark, but you kept telling those stories by the fire." "Dad," I interjected, trying to redirect him. "It's not safe to think about those times. We need to focus on the present." He ignored me, lost in his thoughts. "I remember you thought there were monsters in the woods." His eyes, now brimming with tears, stared out into the rain-soaked night. "You'd keep looking around, waiting for something to jump out." "And I was right to be scared," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. "There are definitely monsters out there." He chuckled lightly, but it quickly morphed into a sob, and I cringed. This was the emotional roller coaster I had learned to navigate since I was a child. One minute we were sharing memories, and the next I was drowning in his sadness. My thoughts flickered back to the stories I had heard about the river. There was the tale of Annabelle, a girl who had vanished after attempting to jump the gutter. They had searched for her for days, only to find her SOS beacon blinking futilely, signaling for help. No one had ever discovered her body. I often imagined her, trapped in the darkness of the river, calling for her parents as the cold water enveloped her. "Jake," Dad's voice pulled me back. "You know I never wanted this for us." "I know," I sighed, my heart heavy with his sorrow. "But you can't keep holding on to the past. You need to live for me, for us." As we rounded the bend, I spotted a cross by the riverbank, adorned with wilted flowers. I recognized it immediately. It was for Bethany, the little girl who had gone missing years ago. Her father had witnessed her fall into the river, and the town had never truly forgiven him. Rumors swirled, casting shadows over the tragedy, and eventually he disappeared too. A dangerous encounter. The sight of the cross struck a chord deep within me, stirring old memories of childhood whispers and campfire tales. As I drove past, I caught a glimpse of something, an ethereal figure standing in the road, barely illuminated by the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as the figure materialized. It was a woman, her hair whipping in the wind, her dress flowing as if caught in an unseen current. "What the hell?" I gasped, my mind racing. "Jake," Dad's voice trembled. "Is that Jessica?" "No, no, no!" I shouted, panic surging through me. "Stay in the car!" I was about to shout more when the figure raised a hand, beckoning him closer. "Dad, get back!" I yelled, but he was already stumbling out of the car, drawn to the woman like a moth to a flame. "Jessica!" he cried, his voice filled with longing. "Is it really you?" The woman stood still, her gaze locked onto him, an otherworldly glow surrounding her. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I recognized the face. She looked just like my mother. "Please, come to me," she whispered, her voice soft yet powerful. I dashed out of the car, lunging for my father. "Don't you dare! She's not real! She's a ghost!" But he didn't seem to hear me. He was entranced, eyes glassy, stepping closer to the figure in the rain-soaked darkness. "I've missed you so much, Jessica," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. Suddenly the atmosphere shifted. The wind howled, and the figure's smile twisted into something sinister. "Come to me, my love," she cooed, her voice wrapping around him like a snake. "Dad!" I screamed, fear gripping my heart. "Don't do it! You can't follow her into the darkness!" But it was too late. In a moment of despair, he stumbled forward, his hands reaching out for the ghostly figure. "I can't live without you." Just as he reached her, the ground beneath him crumbled. I watched in horror as he slipped toward the river, the dark waters roiling beneath him. "Dad!" I lunged, grabbing his arm, pulling with every ounce of strength I had. "Let me go," he shouted, desperation clawing at his voice. "I need her. I can't be alone." "Dad, please," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "You can't leave me. You can't go to her." But his expression shifted, the turmoil of grief wrestling with the love he felt for me. "You don't understand," he started, but I was not about to let him slip away. With a desperate surge of energy, I yanked him back, managing to pull him away from the edge of the river just as a wave crashed against the bank, threatening to sweep him in. The figure let out a mournful wail, the sound echoing in the night as she vanished into the shadows. For a fleeting moment, the storm quieted, and I felt the weight of my father's body against mine, our shared breath mingling in the cool night air. "Jake!" he gasped, struggling to find his footing. "What just happened? Where did she go?" "She was trying to take you!" I shouted, my voice thick with emotion. "You can't follow her. She's not Mom. She's a ghost. Don't you get it?" My father blinked, confusion slowly dissipating the fog of intoxication clouding his mind. "I thought," he started, but the words trailed off as the realization washed over him. The rain drummed relentlessly against our bodies, soaking us to the bone, but I could see the clarity returning to his eyes. "I thought I lost you," I said, voice breaking. You almost went back to her." "I was so foolish," he murmured, sinking to his knees in the mud, his hands gripping my shoulders tightly. I let my grief take over. I was so lost in my memories of her. I didn't want to be alone anymore. The confession hung between us like the heavy mist surrounding the river. I knelt beside him, our foreheads nearly touching. "You don't have to be alone. You have me, Dad. You have to fight for us, for what we still have." He nodded slowly, and the sorrow in his gaze shifted to something warmer, a flicker of hope, a spark of life that had been absent for so long. "I'm so sorry for everything, Jake, for dragging you through this mess. You've had to take care of me when I should have been taking care of you." "It's okay," I whispered, my heart aching for the father I had lost to grief. "We'll figure this out together, I promise." Facing the darkness. As we stood up, I realized that the storm had calmed, leaving behind only the gentle pitter-patter of raindrops against the leaves. The haunting atmosphere of the Devil's Gutter lingered, but it felt less oppressive now. The cross marking Bethany's death glimmered faintly in the moonlight, a reminder of the shadows that loomed in our past. I glanced at my father, who was staring at the river, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Do you think they're really down there?" he asked, his voice low and contemplative. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But whatever happens, we can't let it take us. We need to face our past, not be consumed by it." He sighed deeply, his breath mingling with the cool night air. "I don't want to end up like them," he murmured. "I don't want to be just another name in the gutter's list of victims." "We won't be," I vowed, determination fueling my words. "We'll break the cycle. We'll find a way to honor Mom without letting her memory drown us. She wouldn't want this for us." As we turned to leave, I felt a shift in the air. The tension that had wrapped around us seemed to dissipate, and with it, the darkness that had haunted us for so long began to lift. We climbed back into the car, the rain having subsided to a gentle drizzle. I started the engine, and as we pulled away from the river, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The waters shimmered under the moonlight, a stark reminder of the lives claimed by the Devil's Gutter, yet somehow I felt a sense of closure. A new chapter. The drive home was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, one filled with unspoken understanding. As I navigated the familiar roads, I could feel a weight lifting off my shoulders, a promise of healing, of moving forward. "Jake," Dad said softly, breaking the silence, "I know I've messed up, but I want to try. I want to be better. For you." I nodded, a small smile creeping onto my face. "That's all I ask, Dad. Just try." In that moment, I realized that while the past would always linger, it didn't have to define us. Together, we could rewrite our story, transforming the darkness into something lighter, something filled with hope. As we neared home, I could see the lights flickering in the distance, illuminating the path ahead. I felt a renewed sense of purpose coursing through me. It was time to let go of the past, to honor the memories without allowing them to suffocate us. We pulled into the driveway and I parked the car. The rain had left everything glistening, the world seeming to sparkle in the moonlight. As we stepped out into the cool night, I felt a sense of freedom, as if I had emerged from the shadows that had loomed over us for so long. "Let's get inside," I said, glancing up at the sky where the clouds were starting to clear. "It's time to make some new memories." My father nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his sadness. Together, we walked toward the house, leaving the ghosts of the past behind. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with each step, we were breaking free from the darkness and embracing the light. feed in his name and rejoice. That's at least what Google Translate told me when I looked up that phrase after the compound I had discovered, the one I had escaped from. I am posting this here in hopes that someone saves it before it gets taken down. For everyone who knows me and has been worried sick about my disappearance, I suggest you forget about me and expose the greater truth. The missing case. Yesterday, I got a new case. It was one that felt pretty unsurprising to me, but also heavy with dread. As a private investigator, I'd become accustomed to the worst side of humanity. I had dealt with theft, murder, domestic abuse, child abuse, and sexual abuse. I even worked on a missing person case that involved one of Richard Ramirez's victims when I lived in California, so I was prepared for just about anything. This particular case seemed tamer than others I had worked on in the past. A woman's homeless brother had gone missing. She came into my office with worry etched on her face, an old photograph clutched tightly in her hands. "He's been missing for a week now," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't find his new address since he switched bridges." She explained how the homeless community had their own sort of address system for drug deals and transient living, using specific locations known only to them. "The last place he told me he was staying was at 8th Under, but I've already checked 3rd and 5th, she continued, desperation creeping into her voice. I asked the simple questions. Was he doing drugs? Involved with a gang? Did he want to lose contact with you for any reason? She shook her head vehemently. "He's a good guy who just went bankrupt after his business failed. I offered him a room, but he wouldn't take it." She gave me more information, nothing I thought was particularly important. I started looking into his background. He was an interesting case. Top of his class in high school, at least. He never went to college, but tried his hand at entrepreneurship. He ran a window cleaning service, a bakery, and even an old folks' home. Each venture seemed to slip through his fingers, one after the other, culminating in a failed startup hospital that drove him into homelessness just 3 months ago. His sister had already checked the usual spots, but had found no trace of him. The investigation. As I drove through town with the mostly smog-covered sky above me, I headed back to 8th Under. I recalled having been there before when another homeless person had gone missing 2 months prior. The bridge loomed ahead, its rusted structure silhouetted against the dimming light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and as I pulled over, I saw the beggar I had spoken to last time. He was still there, his ragged clothes barely offering any warmth against the chill of the approaching evening. Empty bottles lay sprawled around him, remnants of a day filled with indulgence. A shopping cart filled with trash sat nearby, testament to his long-standing presence there. "Any change for a poor soul, sir?" he croaked, raising his head as I approached. I tossed him $1, and he recognized me instantly. "Why, sir, it's you. I remember you. Why are you here?" "Another missing person, Rico," I replied, pulling out the photo of the brother. "So? People go missing every day, just as people die every day, just as the sun rises and falls every day, and just as people who find their place are labeled as lost." His words hung in the air, forcing me to ponder the implications. I handed him the photo, and he took it without hesitation, rummaging through his shopping cart for something. "That photo won't do no good. He had already transcended. The transformation started and now has passed," he said cryptically. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly before launching into a convoluted rant. Whether it was the alcohol speaking or some form of deep truth, I couldn't tell, but I hung on to a few words as he continued to speak. "I mean to be a bridge, like this one, but instead of cars, I mean to pass a spark of ignition to the mind. I mean to decide the start and end. I mean to ferry those who ask, and I mean to collect no toll. I mean to build a staircase to heaven and lock all out with exception to those of my choosing." I interrupted him. "Can you point me in the direction of this man for $20? He took the money without hesitation and produced a photo of an old campground, unnamed and unfamiliar. "Rico, do you have any idea where this is?" I asked, but he was already distracted by a newcomer who had brought him more alcohol. I turned away, slipping the photo into my pocket, unsure of its significance. A string of bad luck. Back in the car, I decided to search for nearby campgrounds. Nothing seemed to match, so I headed to the library on the edge of the city to look up old records that might not have made it onto the internet. Upon entering, I was distracted by 2 men jumping an old woman outside the entrance. I watched from my car as they ripped her purse away and threw her to the ground. A man with a dog walked by, witnessed the robbery, and simply continued on his way. He shouted at his dog, who was barking at the 2 men as they fled with their loot. I lit a cigarette, feeling a mix of anger and hopelessness. I entered the library, eager to delve into the old records. Inside, I began flipping through papers about old campgrounds while trying to ignore the smell of stale coffee and dust. The librarian shot me disapproving looks, but I was too engrossed in my search to care. Just then, I heard a loud crash outside. Startled, I rushed to the window to see my parked car totaled. Another car smashed against it. I stepped outside to confront the idiot responsible, only to discover it was a cop. To my disbelief, he turned off his body cam and handed me a ticket for reckless driving. I was furious as people walked by, completely indifferent to the chaos. I started my car, now with a busted bumper, and attempted to drive to the store. About halfway there, my back tires blew out. Unable to afford a mechanic, I parked it and continued on foot. I finally made it to the store, needing to catch my breath. As I lit up another cigarette, I noticed a mother outside with a sign that read, "Please adopt and give her a home." Entering the store, the bell jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to my mood. The store owner, a typical redneck type, greeted me. He had pale skin, long, thin strands of hair, and a crooked, yellowed smile. "What are you looking for, sir?" he asked, eyeing my cigarette. "A new fly rod. My old one broke catching the biggest trout you ever saw," I fibbed, hoping to distract him. He motioned to an employee, small, stout, with hands that looked like they could crush boulders, smoking a cigar. "You can't smoke in here, sir," the owner snapped. "Why does he get to smoke?" I retorted, irritated. "'Cause he works here." I asked, "If I buy something, can I keep smoking?" But his employee interjected, "If you buy something, can I keep fucking your mother?" They both burst into laughter, and I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. "Put that out," the owner demanded. I complied, flicking the remnants into the trash. "What was it you were saying?" he said, as I tried to steer the conversation back. "I wanted a new fly rod, but I also have some questions about—" "Hank," he shouted, suddenly startling me, "how much money do you got?" The employee held up a finger and made a zero. "Those fellas up in the hills still looking for food." I was confused but intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" The owner's eyes glinted with something dark. "You said you had some questions, right?" I nodded, but before I could respond, Hank lunged at me, tackling me to the ground. "Fuck!" I gasped, struggling against him. "Get off me!" The owner laughed. "No one said you could wake up." As Hank pinned me down, I could barely breathe. I managed to twist and turn enough to get free momentarily before the owner re-entered the fray. "Stop squirming!" he yelled, moving to restrain me as I tried to escape. I was overwhelmed, both physically and mentally, and in a moment of desperation, I headbutted the owner in the stomach, shoving him backward before dashing for the exit. A fight for survival. I tore out of the store, adrenaline surging through my veins, heart racing as I heard shouts from behind. The world outside felt foreign. Colors brightened, the air crisp. I bolted down the street, glancing back to see them pursuing me. As I rounded the corner, my lungs burned. I could hear them gaining on me, the pounding of feet echoing behind me. I dodged into an alley, heart hammering against my ribcage. I stumbled past trash bins, old newspapers swirling around me like specters. Suddenly I skidded to a stop, noticing a door ajar in the side of a building. Without a second thought, I slipped inside and pressed my back against the wall, listening intently. The pounding footsteps grew louder, but they faded as my pursuers ran past the alley. Once I was certain they were gone, I took a moment to catch my breath. I glanced around the dimly lit room and saw it was filled with old furniture and a thick layer of dust covering everything. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows against the walls. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I crept further into the room, scanning for any potential weapons or tools that could help me escape if they found me again. My eyes fell upon a rusted crowbar leaning against a rickety old table. I grabbed it, the metal cold and heavy in my hands, and held it tightly, ready for whatever might come next. A frightening discovery. Just then, I heard muffled voices coming from outside. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to catch what they were saying. "Did you see where he went?" one voice asked, clearly frustrated. "Check the back alleys. He couldn't have gotten far," came the reply, gruff and menacing. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was running out of time. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made my heart race even faster. I needed to move. I creaked the door open just enough to peek outside. The coast was clear, but I could hear them moving closer. Their voices becoming clearer with each passing second. I decided to make a break for it, moving as quietly as I could. I slipped out into the alley, clutching the crowbar, and looked both ways before dashing toward the next street. The faint sounds of the bustling city filled my ears, contrasting sharply with the silence I had just left behind. I reached the main street and slowed down, trying to blend in with the crowd. As I walked, I could feel my heart racing with fear and anger. I couldn't let them catch me, not after everything that had happened. Seeking help. As I wandered through the throngs of people, I desperately searched for someone I could trust. I needed to find a way to get help and expose the sick, twisted operation I had stumbled into. My mind flashed back to the earlier conversation with Rico. He had mentioned that the homeless had their own network of support. Maybe someone among them could help me get back on my feet. I took a deep breath and headed toward a nearby park where the homeless often gathered. I needed to find Rico again. I remembered him as a man with insight, someone who knew the city better than anyone else. As I approached the park, I spotted Rico sitting on a bench, talking with a group of people. I hurried over, urgency flooding my veins. "Rico," I called out, breathless, "I need your help." He turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's happened?" I quickly explained everything, the store, the owner, and the nuns. I shared how they had taken me captive and how they were somehow connected to a larger, more sinister network. Rico listened intently, nodding along, and when I finished he leaned back on the bench, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "We've heard whispers, things about that place. It's not just some store. They're part of something darker. You're lucky to have escaped." "What do you mean?" I asked, panic gripping my chest. "There's talk about them sacrificing people, trying to appease something that feeds off fear and despair." He paused, his eyes darkening. "They say it's been happening for years, hidden away from the world, gathering the community." Rico's words sent a shiver down my spine. I had uncovered something much more dangerous than I had imagined. I couldn't just leave this behind. I needed to gather the community, to make them aware of what was happening. "Can you help me?" I asked. "We need to get everyone together, spread the word. They can't keep getting away with this." Rico nodded, determination etched into his features. "I'll do what I can. We'll get the word out. This is bigger than just you. It's about everyone who's gone missing." We spent the rest of the day working together. Rico reached out to his network, while I scoured the area for anyone who would listen. We gathered stories, names, and connections, piecing together a tapestry of the horror that had unfolded in the shadows of our city. As night fell, we organized a meeting at the park, urging anyone who had experienced loss or had suspicions about the store to come. People began to gather, their faces worn with the struggles of life on the streets. I stood before them, the weight of my own experience pressing heavily on my shoulders. "I'm not here to scare you," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "I'm here to unite us. We need to expose the truth. Uniting the lost." As I spoke, more and more faces emerged from the dark, drawn by the urgency in my voice. They shared their own stories, recounting the people they had lost to the shadows of the city, to the very place I had escaped from. Each story added fuel to the fire of our cause, each lost soul a reminder of what was at stake. By the end of the night, we had a plan. We would gather evidence, confront the owner, and rally the community against the terror that lurked in the darkness. With renewed purpose, we worked together in the following days, gathering testimonies and stories, collecting any information we could about the store, the nuns, and the dark forces at play. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that we were not just facing a few rogue individuals. We were up against a twisted network of power and control that thrived on fear and despair. The night before we were to confront the store owner, I found myself unable to sleep. The events of the past week played through my mind like a movie reel. The faces of the people I had met, the stories I had gathered, the sacrifices that had been made. I realized this was no longer just about me. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had disappeared without a trace. Confronting the darkness. The next day, armed with evidence and a resolve that burned deep within us, we marched to the store. I felt a wave of courage wash over me as we stepped inside. The owner was there, leaning against the counter, surprise flickering in his eyes as he looked at the crowd gathered before him. "What's this? A little protest?" he scoffed, trying to sound dismissive, but I could see the hint of fear lurking beneath his bravado. "We know what you've been doing," I said, stepping forward. "We know about the sacrifices, the missing people. You can't hide anymore." The tension in the air was palpable. The store owner's expression twisted into a mask of rage as he slammed his fist against the counter. "You think you can come in here and make accusations? You're all nothing but worthless trash." But we stood united, unfazed by his words. One by one, members of the community stepped forward, sharing their stories, recounting the people they had lost and the suspicions they had harbored. The store owner's bravado cracked, and I felt a surge of hope. This was our moment to reclaim our voices, to confront the darkness that had haunted our community for far too long. A final stand. Just as it seemed the tide was turning in our favor, the two nuns emerged from the shadows, their expressions twisted with fury. "You shouldn't have come here," one hissed, her eyes narrowing. "You'll pay for your insolence." Panic surged through the crowd as the nuns lunged forward, but we had each other's backs, and the momentum of our united front held strong. I grabbed a nearby fishing rod from a display, swinging it toward them. "We're not afraid of you." The store owner and the nuns were taken aback by our defiance, and in that moment, we pressed our advantage. The store erupted into chaos, bodies colliding, shouts echoing. We fought back against their dark presence, pushing them toward the back of the store where they had kept their secrets hidden. In the frenzy, we managed to corner the store owner. His bravado faded entirely as we pressed him for answers. "What have you done with them? Where are they?" But just as I thought we would finally get some answers, he let out a laugh, a twisted sound filled with malice. "You think this ends here? You're just a footnote in a much larger story. You're too late." The revelations. In that moment, the door slammed open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the light. It was a police officer, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on in here?" he shouted, stepping into the chaos. "Arrest him! He's been sacrificing people!" I shouted, pointing at the store owner. But the officer's eyes narrowed suspiciously as he scanned the scene, and I realized he wasn't on our side. "Everyone, back away!" the officer commanded, his hand resting on his holster. As the crowd hesitated, the store owner took advantage. He lunged for a nearby weapon and chaos erupted again. But in the frenzy, the officer shouted, "You're all under arrest!" I felt despair wash over me. Had we risked everything for nothing? The unraveling. The officer's words sent shockwaves through the crowd. Confusion and panic spread like wildfire. People scrambled to back away from the escalating situation, glancing from the officer to the store owner and back again. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the precariousness of our situation. Had we put ourselves in danger only to be arrested? But the officer's eyes darted toward the store owner, narrowing in suspicion. "What's going on here?" he demanded, taking a step forward. The store owner's bravado faltered. "These people are trespassing. They're trying to ruin my business," he spat, his eyes flickering nervously between the officer and the nuns, who were now regaining their composure behind him. I seized the moment and stepped forward, my heart racing. "No, they're part of this. They're involved in the disappearances." I pointed at the nuns, who stood eerily calm now, their expressions inscrutable behind their masks. The officer glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "You sure about that?" "Look at the evidence," I shouted, my voice rising. "Look at the people they've hurt, the missing individuals who have vanished without a trace." The officer hesitated, his gaze shifting between the owner and the crowd. In that fleeting moment, I could see the gears turning in his mind. "Everyone, stay calm," he shouted, trying to regain control over the situation. "Step back and let me figure this out." A game of cat and mouse. As the officer tried to assert his authority, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The store owner was visibly sweating, his bravado slipping as the officer continued to question him. I could see the fear flickering in his eyes. He knew he was cornered. Suddenly, the nuns moved in closer to the officer, whispering something urgently. I couldn't make out their words, but the officer's expression hardened as he listened. My heart raced. Were they convincing him to side with them? "Listen," the officer said, turning back to the crowd. "I need you all to back off. This isn't your business anymore. You're all going to clear out of here." "Are you kidding?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "They're the ones responsible for everything. Don't let them manipulate you." But before I could say more, the store owner lunged for a nearby crowbar. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive. A fight for freedom. The officer reacted quickly, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the store owner. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice steady. The tension escalated as the store owner hesitated, torn between defending himself and saving face. The nuns moved with alarming speed, grabbing the officer from behind and attempting to restrain him. "You don't know what you're getting into," one of them hissed, her voice dripping with malice. In the ensuing chaos, I seized the moment. With adrenaline coursing through me, I charged at the store owner, brandishing the crowbar I had picked up earlier. "Get away from him," I yelled, swinging it with all my strength. The impact echoed through the store as the crowbar connected with the store owner's side, sending him sprawling. He crashed to the ground, gasping for breath. With the officer momentarily distracted, I turned to the crowd. "We need to take control. Help me subdue them." In that moment, the power shifted. More people surged forward, emboldened by the unexpected turn of events. The crowd worked together, pushing back against the nuns, who were struggling to regain their footing. Unmasking the truth. As the scuffle continued, I caught a glimpse of the officer's face. He was torn, caught between maintaining order and acknowledging the truth unraveling before him. "Officer!" I shouted, trying to reach him through the chaos. "You have to see this. They're responsible for everything, the disappearances, the murders." The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the chaos. In that moment of uncertainty, the store owner attempted to rise, panic flashing across his face. "Stop him!" I yelled, but it was too late. The officer was taken by surprise as the owner lunged for his weapon, struggling to take control of the situation once more. I pushed through the throng of bodies, determined to keep the officer focused. We can't let them escape. They're part of a cult, a network that's been sacrificing people. The officer finally seemed to register my words, and he called out, "Everyone, back away. I need backup." The arrival of justice. The moment the words left his mouth, the sound of sirens filled the air, drawing closer and closer. The store owner's eyes widened in panic as the realization dawned on him. "No!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet and moving toward the back exit. "Stop him!" I cried, adrenaline surging as I tried to intercept him. But before I could reach him, the nuns made their move. They charged past me, but it was too late. The door swung open, and officers flooded in, armed and ready to take control of the situation. The chaos reached a fever pitch as the officers subdued the nuns and store owner, wrestling them to the ground. I watched as the tide of justice rolled in, replacing the fear that had gripped me moments before. "Everyone step back," an officer shouted, pushing through the crowd. "We've got this." The aftermath. As the dust settled and the situation was brought under control, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers began questioning the remaining people in the store, collecting statements and evidence against the store owner and the nuns. I took a moment to catch my breath, leaning against the wall and watching the scene unfold. I felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. How had we managed to turn the tide? Rico stepped beside me, his face reflecting the exhaustion and adrenaline that pulsed through the room. "You did it," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "You brought them down." I nodded, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "But there's so much more to uncover," I said, the weight of reality pressing down on me. "This was just the tip of the iceberg. We need to make sure the rest of the community knows the truth." The ripple effect. In the following weeks, the news of the operation spread like wildfire. Articles flooded the papers, stories were shared, and survivors stepped forward, reclaiming their voices. The community that had once been silent was now unified, determined to stand against the darkness that had hidden in the shadows for far too long. As I continued my work as a private investigator, I couldn't shake the sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on my shoulders. Each case I took on now held a deeper meaning. I was not just uncovering the truth for myself. I was fighting for every person who had been silenced, for every name that had been forgotten. And as the community healed, I found solace in the bonds we had forged. I continued to work with Rico and others to build a support network for those who had experienced loss and trauma. We held meetings, shared stories, and helped one another reclaim their lives. A new beginning. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, I sat with Rico on a park bench. The sounds of laughter filled the air as families enjoyed the summer evening. "I never imagined it would come to this," I said, glancing at the vibrant scene before us. "I thought I was just a private investigator chasing shadows." Rico smiled knowingly. "Sometimes it takes a little darkness to uncover the light. You did more than just investigate. You inspired a community." I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that resonated within me. I won't stop. There are still so many stories left to uncover, so many voices to give power to. And as I looked out at the city, a sense of hope filled my heart. I was no longer just an observer. I was a part of something larger. Together, we would face the darkness and bring it to light, one case at a time. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.